Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone has been enjoying a wonderful, amazing day of such incredible panels and discussions as we talk about reimagining the space archives in these spaces. My name is Holly Smith. I have the pleasure of serving as the college archivist at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And I give the caveat, please excuse my voice. It's that seasonal time of allergies, so I hope everyone can hear me okay. Before we get started with my two amazing colleagues and comrades, I'd like to read a statement of welcome from our wonderful colleague, Leah Kerr, who is with us and is unfortunately under the weather, but has a statement that to welcome us and situate us into the space. So this is from Leah. Welcome and thanks for joining the conversation. These talks arose from what wowed me while working on this extraordinary OSOT project. We are seeking to help Black freedom movement groups to achieve their work while in action as accurate documentation for themselves, historians, and other activists in the future. Too many times in the past, Black freedom movement groups have been misrepresented, by historians, archives, and journalists. We wanted to get ahead of that for the Black Lives Matter era groups. Along the way, we met artists, archivists, activists who were finding unique paths to amplify their voices with archival primary sources. I feel it would be a disservice for OSOT to go dark without shining a light on some of these efforts. This conversation is just a taste of what is out there. Hopefully, it will be a point of inspiration and very practical how to's for others to document, speak, paint, illustrate, and recreate their experiences to add to the fullness of our striving for freedom for all. Thanks for coming, and thanks to our speakers for being my voice as bronchitis has taken mine away. So, we again thank Leah for her incredible work. We again also send her good healing vibes and wishes and again are grateful to each of the participants for being here today. And speaking of inspirational, I would like to introduce the two wonderful colleagues I have the pleasure of being in conversation with and that I've had the pleasure of knowing for quite a long time. So the first thing we'll do, we'll start to introduce Dr. Ida Jones. Dr. Ida Jones serves as the Associate Director of Special Collections and University Archivist at Morgan State University. She graduated from Howard University and served as the Assistant Curator of Manuscripts in Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center for 15 years. She has held numerous leadership positions, including in the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Association of Black Women Historians, and the Society of American Archivists. Currently, she is the National Vice President for Membership for ASALA, co-vice president of the Baltimore City Historical Society, Washington, D.C. State Coordinator for the National Votes for Women Trail, and a board member, of the National Collaborative Women's History Sites and the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. Additionally, she is the author of 4 books, The Heart of the Race Problem, The Life of Kelly Miller, Mary McLeod Bethune in Washington, D.C., Activism and Education in Logan Circle, William Henry Jernigan in Washington, D.C., Faith in the Fight for Civil Rights, and Baltimore civil rights leader Victorine Q. Adams, The Power of the Ballot. So my next comrade colleague, John B. Gartrell, serves as director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture at the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. He's been an archivist for over 2 decades, specializing in research, instruction, and curation in collections of the African diaspora. At the Franklin Research Center, he also serves on the board of the Movement History Initiative, a collaborative group of academics, archivists, and activists dedicated to documenting the grassroots organizing tradition. He has worked collaboratively on a number of grant projects designed to expand digital access to the Black archival collections, including Beneath the Underground at the Maryland State Archives, Diaspora Pathways Archival Access Project at Johns Hopkins University, Morgan State, and the Afro-American Newspapers and the SNCC Digital Gateway, Behind the Veil, and Our Story, Our Terms at Duke University. So again, I'm just so grateful to be in conversation and community with Dr. Ida and Dr. John, Mr. John, excuse me. So I have a series of, we'll start, I'll ask our esteemed panelists a few questions and we'll have a discussion and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. So please use the Q&A feature to drop your questions. And again, thank you all for being here. So to get started, John and Ida, um, could you all elaborate? Well, we talked a little bit about each of you all's work. So the first thing I want to do is really ask, thinking about the work that you've done across diverse communities, how would you define community archives, number one? And number two, if there was a specific project that either I mentioned in your intro or that you want to focus on and highlight in relation to that question, please feel free to do so. So the first part, how would you define community archives?
Well, I'll thank my host. I want to thank John Gartrell for his friendship and his camaraderie and inviting me to this. And Leah, my spirit sister who can't be with me today, please feel free to use the keyboard since you're unable to communicate. And I know we talked about this as well. And thank you, of course, Holly, for your lovely introduction. And it's funny because I'm teaching the archives class here at Morgan, and we just had that section, I think, last week. So I read the definition. I don't remember it anymore, but when I think of community is a gathering of people, usually of some level of commonality, whether it's geographically, we all live on the same street, ideologically, we all believe in the same team or color or whatever kind of rallying cry, religion, expression of faith, or just simply a matter of immediacy, like we're going to establish some kind of element in our community. Like there's one here in not DC, I'm getting so confused. In Baltimore, there's the Victorine Q. Adams Freedom Garden, Victory Adams Garden. So they actually grow fruit and vegetables in this community garden. And these neighbors kind of surround this space. So they were able to purchase that land from the city to create a green space for all the houses back into this. And they all look different. They're not they're heterogeneous, not a homogenous community of people. So they've created community. And my work on Victorine Adams, which is most recent work that I've done, and it's unusual place, you could do good dead history, so I like 1930s back. But this woman fascinated me, and she was born in 1912 and just passed away in 2008, I believe. So there are people who are living who knew her. And so they were so excited to see this story about her life being given some kind of dimension because she was very impactful. So I do belong to the community gardens group, and I have gone there, met fellowship with them and done other things with them and given copies of the books to the children to kind of read about who this woman was, who was a neighbor. So when I think of community, long answer, I suppose, would be a group of people who connect over a intangible or emotional element of something. And they seek to document that something in the way in which they live, move, or express their narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. And I'm just glad to be on here with my sisters here. So as Holly said, we know each other for a long time. So I think for me, and Holly, I'm gonna ask you to say the second part of the question again in a minute. The way I would sort of define a community archive is a body, generally we think of archives as like things you can touch and feel, right? And that definition has kind of been expanded to the oral history tradition. So now it's the sort of audio visual experience. But sometimes an archive is an actual person, right? There's somebody who is in the African tradition, the griot, right? Or the storyteller, the holder of history in the past that can weave what's going on today with the experience of the past. And I think all of us likely have like an elder, or maybe it's us, who is the person that hands down like the family tradition. And so we ourselves can be community archives in that sort of metaphysical sense. But I think in general, we think about community archives as not being materials that are not in an institution. And that's kind of true, but it's also sort of what Ida said. It's something that reflects the past that a group can um, convene around. And sometimes that does happen in institutions. Both you are at HBCUs, and so the HBCU itself is considered a community archive because of the legacy that it extends. And me being a place that's a predominantly white institution, like or historically white institution, like Duke, we still see communities come into our repository and use the archives for research or commemorations, celebrations, etc. And so I think it's a really broad um, definition. But when I think what most people would say and what triggers a definition for them is generally something that by the people, for the people, with the people, right? That created that thing. And who can actually see the true value of it without necessarily any layer of interpretation. It's almost innate. Um, and it's more often than not handed down from one generation to the next. So, Holly, say the second part of the question again.
No, thank you, Ida and John. Those were excellent. So, John, the second half is going into that great the great definitions you both gave around community archives. Feel free to give any examples, or is there a project that you worked on specifically in working with individuals or working with community archives as well?
I'll go first, Ida, if that's okay. I think the thing that comes to mind for me is prior to coming to Duke, I was the archivist at the Afro-American newspaper, which is headquartered in Baltimore City. It's the oldest family-owned African-American publication in the country, founded in 1892. And so while I was there, we were engaged in a grant project that was in partnership with Morgan State, my alma mater, Johns Hopkins, and the Afro to quote digitize the newspaper archives or what was the morgue, which is a new like a term in journalism that means like when a story is put to bed, they put all the resources that went into creating that story, and that morgue essentially is the archive of the newspaper. Um, so prior to that grant, the archive itself was inaccessible to the public. It was really only the staff of the newspaper that was able to readily access it. And what started off as a digitization project actually turned into the creation of the first inventory of that archive. And we had to do that, one, to gain intellectual control, but two, to be able to share with the public that this well of materials exists. And it allowed the newspaper to sort of open up the doors to the community uh, for an institution that was built by the community itself. And so the Afro would not still be in existence today if you didn't have generation after generation subscribing to the newspaper. But the other thing that I found in doing that work was that the stories of the people that worked for the paper stretched across families and decades. You had people who grew up selling newspapers, people who grew up participating in community events that they would do, like the Clean Block campaign. And so having that archive sort of opened up to the general public allowed people to track down, oh, my mother was in the paper because she graduated in the class, like Dunbar High School in the class of so-and-so. Or, I was the clean block captain of my block in 1970, whatever. Can you find a picture of me? And so that was a perfect example of something that initially was sort of closed off and really in private hands and still remains in private hands. But the community really was brought into it because of the archiving work that was done on that project. And so expanding that accessibility to the materials really opened up the possibilities for people to be able to discover their own story.
Excellent. Thank you both so much for those thought-provoking answers, and I can't wait for the discussion to dig deeper. So the next question, so you all illuminated some of your experiences working with communities and community archives. Can you describe any particular challenges as well as positive opportunities that you all have had in such community projects, collaborative projects?
That's a very good question in regards to something John has said about an individual can be an archive is very interesting because the community work that I started with in the 90s, early 90s, was of course in a Black church. And so we know that churches like the junk drawer, the junk closet in your family home has a kind of rather diverse elements of the lived experience. And of course, my parents were Depression era people, so everything had a second and third life. So nothing got thrown away. So they were great, masterful, low carbon footprint people because everything was going to have a second, third, or fourth life before it was finally given permanent retirement outside of the home. So to that being said, the communities have kept their own record. And I'm doing some exploration now on Black librarians in the HBCU space who are the vanguard of the proto-archivists. They were very clear that all of this is about yesterday, all of this is about memory, and it's information. So they were very skilled in curating information and keeping it somewhat organized in terms of what they were given to hold up the sky with no assistance. So that is kind of the challenge. Is there's great potential, there's great opportunity to collect material, but it does not have the white glove treatment of a NARA or regional archives because it doesn't have budgeting and funding along those lines, nor is there a cultural sensitivity to the idea that things cannot be put in their pipes or put in the basement, or I'll bring it back tomorrow, and this can't happen to collection material. So I think the bitter and the sweet are so mixed together very well that you don't really taste one or the other too often, and sometimes it does get sweet, and then sometimes there will be a sour moment, but ideally it's a labor of love. So to the short story is that one church I worked with in Georgetown that just turned 200 and I think 10 years old this year, they had been saving things since the 1820s when they opened up, and they were a station on the Underground Railroad as well, and they have lovely documents from that era in terms of documenting the membership and what someone went north or somebody did this or what have you. And they were told a number of occasions that the documents weren't sufficient enough in volume or importance to be given a grant from the NHPRC at NARA. So really, I don't understand. So in my puppy years, I was like, wow, okay, well, we're just going to try and find more. But some of the more mature persons who would have been in their 70s and 80s I was working with had said, we've heard this no before so often that we just seek to just do what we can for ourselves. So the United Methodist Church, of which they were affiliated, has a History and Archive Commission that is denomination-wide. Now, some of the Black churches who are in that body don't like it because they see the kind of colonization of memory and they choose not to participate. So even in that situation, in which this one denomination had materials going back for 200 plus years and did the best they could, this vault they had, which is probably from the 1820s or something, that had a special kind of combination lock. The doors were like, huge cast iron, whatever, and they kept them there and they were allowed to survive because this safe clearly would not melt even if the sun itself descended and sat on top of it. It would not melt. So they had been doing that for that time. But the sad part is they did not get the visibility or the access that John talked about because they did not exist in a public space. And it was kind of like, well, give us your stuff and then we'll tell people about you. Well, I'm all about, no, I'm going to help you maintain your things and let people come to you. And let's talk about how that goes down. So I think it's important to say that there's a bitterness and there's a sweetness there, but you have to applaud those stewards and those curators who are self-appointed kind of guardians of this memory and thinking about who those papers speak for or speak to, not just ancestors, but also themselves and then their progeny.
One of the biggest challenges is actually internal, and it's kind of checking your ego at the door. As people who've been trained as archivists, whether you went to library school and you have an MLS degree, or you got a degree in history, and you've been working in archives for however many years, decades, etc. Anytime you approach a community, you assume in that dynamic that you're the expert in that space. Like, well, I know how to do this archiving stuff and you don't, right? Or maybe like, oh, I'm gonna show you how to do this, right? And in reality, it's simply just what I was saying. Like, there have been people who've been doing it all along, and they may be doing it in a different way or a particular way that really speaks to their experience. And that's what matters. That's what's really the most important part. And so taking your ego out of the situation, what you're really saying is, I said, like, well, how can I help you with this? And bring in whatever sort of institutional knowledge you might have with being an archivist or a memory worker as a professional, because that's your 9 to 5, and melding it with the community practice that's actually being done on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and recognizing that the end product might not look anything like what you thought it was going to look like when you began that engagement. Because the second part of it is, you got to really work to earn the trust of that community, even if it's your own community. So I don't have to tell y'all this. I mean, but for the audience, even working at a traditionally Black institution doesn't guarantee you an in with a Black community group. And for from their perspective, everyone's an outsider. And so what you thought might be just like an easy win, or like, I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna do my thing, they're gonna trust me. It's like, in reality, you have to actually pay some dues. And that might mean showing up at an event, moving a table, wiping off, sweeping a floor, moving some chairs, picking up something from somebody who you don't really know. Uh, and it's not because you're it's because you care about what the end product is. It's not a quid pro quo type thing where I'm gonna do this and you're gonna do this for me. The people that you're working with want to know that you're as invested in their story as they are. And the only way, one of the major ways that they know that is the way that you approach, and then the way that you work through. And so I think for me, the challenge isn't necessarily with who you're trying to work with, it's the person who's working with them, and the sort of the internal conversation that you need to have with yourself. Because sometimes uh, that community might not see the value in their history. And so you have to be the one to say, no, we really need this story. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to help us get to a place where this story is preserved. Because there's a hole here in our narrative, and you all have the actual piece of the puzzle to fill it. And that takes time, that takes work. And so I would say that that's the challenges that I would highlight in terms of uh, how to work with community groups and organizations.
No, thank you both for those incredible and insightful answers, and some of the things that immediately struck me that you all spoke about: the importance of being intentional, building trust and transparency. And that was the perfect segue to the next question, which is, what are your thoughts on partnering with predominantly white institutions to preserve collections related to Black history? And to follow up to both of you all, as we all have been attendees of either HBCUs or working at HBCUs, how can HBCUs be better supported to do this work and preserve Black collections? So that first part again, love to get y'all's thoughts. What are your thoughts on partnering with PWIs to preserve Black history?
So since I work at one, um, I think, and I'm going to say this with the bias that is clearly on the table. I don't necessarily see an issue with it, but what I am mindful of is who shows up in the room. And I often say that traditionally, when you walk into a space, we naturally defer to whoever is either at the head of the table or in front of the room or at the lectern. When the person with the real power is sometimes all the way in the back, right? It's the quiet lady at the back of the pew, and she's the one you actually need to get buy-in from. And so for me, when I think about it through the prism of a predominantly white institution, getting into these partnerships, dealing with Black communities, Black history, um, it's about how you show up. And I recognize that I am a Black face in that process, right? And so for me, I try to tell people, no, I do tell people, it's none of my business if you want to give this material to Duke or you want to work with my institution. I'm concerned about saving it. Like, let's start there, right? And it's to an advantage to a place like Duke or like Emory or Yale to have people who look like us on the call to be at that table. What matters more, though, is that Black face at that table being supported and given the resources to do what's necessary to move the project forward. Because it's not just enough to have a Black face there, but it's like, okay, I'm a Black face and I've got these resources and I want to bring these resources to you. And in terms of my own practice, that's how I try to move forward and at least talk about the advantages and disadvantages of working, because that goes to the transparency point that you just mentioned, Holly, of, what does it mean to have it at a place where the majority of the people that are there don't look like you? Is that okay with you? Or can you be sort of the flame that draws other collections to an institution or a repository, and you can make a community exist in that place that otherwise maybe 100 years ago would not have welcomed you, right? And so that's like a real conversation that I often have to have with people. And it's one that I think you have to be willing to acknowledge what the, you know, what the elephant in the room actually is.
Thank you for that question and that response too, John. And I think that part of your integrity, no, all of your integrity, is what has allowed me to kind of convene with you while you were at Duke. And of course, Karen Jefferson, our great godmother of archives, being there as well, having left Howard. So I'm going to be the Black activist in the room, and I have issue with it. I have a problem with even things that are culturally created being in someone else's space, because at the end of the day, universities are empires, they're businesses. And so now that we've been, quote, discovered, and we, quote, have things, now there's going to come off of on high this lovely kind of great white savior. That is problematic, and they can't even help themselves from not doing it, because the sheer presence alone is indicative of this white savior mentality. And I just learned about something at University of Maryland about, oh gosh, the lady something. And so apparently there was this idea of this white librarian kind of doing that kind of work as well, and just have this kind of savior complex. So there is an issue there. Also to the fact that we now have, quote, been discovered when we weren't lost. I can say recovery of Black history is what they're seeking to do, not discover, because it's always been relevant to us. So there are those issues that are thorny ideological problems. And then all institutions are not as possibly as transparent as Duke has been with partners. Others are kind of always, and it's not them, it's the institution scheming. So one institution in the greater Baltimore area did approach me with a lovely piece of Black human bait. Well, we have money and we can't, we think it'd be better to we build our digital space at Morgan, and you can keep it, and people might feel safer there to digitize their material. Well, fun fact, I was writing my own grant and getting my own money to create my own digital space, which we did very successfully. And secondly, at the end of the day, people don't want the format, they want the content of what's there. So when people are coming and digitizing things, are you letting them know who's creating that information? Because I still got my picture, but if 17 other people have a copy of that picture, it no longer becomes exclusively yours because people don't respect the rights of, C, circle in the C, copyright. So there's that ugliness as well. However, on the altruistic side, having materials saved regardless of where they're housed is ultimately the baseline for all information professions. None of us want a fire or any kind of loss or shrinkage through trash or whatever, theft. We want to say the materials are safe somewhere. So that is our ultimate aim. The how do we get to there? That becomes another struggle. I have actually done some collaborative work here in the greater Baltimore area with non-HBCUs to kind of learn the people and learn the fact that the iceberg of higher education is also shrinking. So there'll be less of us in the quote game of higher ed into the 21st century. So we're going to have to play nice and kind of figure out how we're going to exist as a subfield that like art and gym or physical fitness get cut the first. So one school actually fired all their librarians at some school out in the Midwest recently and just basically said, we don't need you. We're going to have this all automated. We're going to use AI. Why pay you? So at some point, it really becomes a matter of bread and butter for us as professionals, but also in terms of the whole experience of a college education or university education is to understand how to think and process and move. And librarians and archivists or information specialists help that. And the records we maintain, be they published or unpublished, help that. And so we want our community, our country, to be literate on all forms, analog and digital, because they can't read the digital or they can't read the analog with understanding context of the technology that influenced one or the other. So I stand torn between all these worlds, but I will have to say at the end of the day, if it's boiled down to its base fact, it would be the altruism of having the materials saved somewhere by someone who understands the greater thing that we're mortal. These things will go past our lives and exceed us or succeed us. And that's what we want to be, good stewards of our time in those materials.
No, thank you both for those incredible insights. So thinking about the second half of that question about how can HBCUs be better supported to do this work in Black collections, I might pick on Ida to pick up her thread to answer that first. Exactly, like if you don't mind, your not only your thoughts on that question, but maybe even describing the grant process that that you went through and having the expertise and knowledge about how you were able to do that work as opposed to just the need for a partner to do this work with questionable motivation. So yeah, I would love to hear, you elaborate on that process more, Ida, and both of your thoughts about how we can collectively support HBCUs better to do the work that we do.
That's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, there has to be a level of cultural sensitivity in, once again, an ideal space, because all HBCUs aren't equal. When you look at a Hampton or a Howard or even Spelman and a Morehouse, Fisk, Prairie View, there are some that are far more advanced in all of this preservation effort, Tuskegee, Bethune-Cookman, because they had the foresight and or some ability to create a space for these things to exist. And not only just exist, but to grow, because archives are an organism. They're not static. Like the books on your shelf have so many now, maybe the next 2 years more. So they're an organism. So you have to kind of account and budget for that. Some institutions that are barely able to keep lights on or students in dorms for a variety of reasons don't have the luxury to even consider these things at the level of stewardship needed to maintain. And I think there was some environmental issue in Louisiana during, Hurricane Katrina or something along those lines about, environmental damage, buildings that are also falling down as well. So there becomes some real hard issues. Do we kind of build a new building or do we save the old building? So I think in light of the fraught nature of the economic fragility, that those of us who are more resourced in the HBCU world, which the HBCU Library Alliance is seeking to do, is to cross-train and cross-fertilize so that we can share possibly this crust of bread, in the words of Dunbar, and so we can break it up and both have a piece of it, and or come together and collaboratively write grants that we all can get something, because there's money out there. And I know writing grants are very hard. I had the grace of God that my colleague here in anthropology at Morgan really kind of spurred me on to do an IMLS grant to fund the digitization of one of our collections. So, because it was helping her and her discipline, but it was also helping me as well. So we were able to do that. And she's kind of a wunderkind because everything she writes gets funded. So using her skill set to connect with a Coppin or a UMES, who's doing very well, by the way. I think they just hired an archivist out there on the Eastern Shore. And then, of course, Bowie as well, looking for an archivist, their person retired, that we have opportunity to kind of coalesce amongst ourselves. And we understand our wounds and weaknesses. So it wouldn't be a shame to see it, because I understand it, I have my own. But I think that idea needs to happen, as well as generationally, because some institutions have older persons. Very few young people are coming into these spaces because of the money or whatever other reasons. And so we need to really think about succession planning as well, because that also helps attract the innovation to do the grant funding that, you know, helps pay for the house at Jackville. So, long answer.
No, that was great. Great answer.
I'll just to jump in a little bit. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a Morgan grad, right? And 20 years ago when I was there was no Ida Jones, right? I couldn't find an archivist on campus who was interested in the history of the institution and collecting. And I was a history major, so like that would have been up my back. There was no internship or work study or even volunteer. You know, when I used to go to the Beulah Davis room, Ida, like somebody was just, oh, well, there's the microphone reader in the back, right? And I think the thing that, and Holly, we've had these conversations offline, so I'll just say it online. The thing that has always frustrated me is our Black colleges and universities pride themselves in tradition and history. That's how they've sold themselves, marketed themselves. And now that we're in a sort of post-pandemic renaissance of enrollment at Black colleges, as sort of the reawakening of Black identity is happening before us, we could potentially have a Black woman president. Amazing, right? But the resources that are going to actually preserving that history within the institutions is criminal. Now, that is also a top-down issue too, where Morgan State has to sue the state of Maryland to get back the money that they're owed for being a state institution and having sort of duplicate programs running at Towson and University of Baltimore and some of these other places, right? And so that struggle, we got to acknowledge that struggle too, that Black colleges as a whole are under-resourced. Heck, even in some white college spaces, they're underfunded. And so the library and the archive is just like a snowflake on top of a mountain that is trying its best to get the resources from a hose that has already been squeezed, right? And so you're just getting a drop of a drop, right? And so I think to Ida's point, leveraging partnerships across institutions is key, in part because a lot of funders are looking for those kinds of projects. The rub is, though, is you got to have somebody who has grant writing experience on your staff to do that labor while also working their full-time job, right? And so we got to acknowledge the effort that we're talking about here. And having been on projects at Duke and at the Afro, where there was a collaboration between a predominantly white institution and HBCUs, if that's what it takes, like I'm kind of hey, what is the end product, right? Now, how you get to that end product is equally as important, because that might determine whether or not that partnership goes on or doesn't. It's just a one-time thing, because there is abuse and there is, like, just because I'm at this white institution, I got all the answers and like, we'll just get this little HBCU a quarter of the budget. And, you know, you can just say you were on a grant. That's not what partnership actually is. The last thing I'll say, and I'm glad you raised this point as well, is that not every HBCU is equal, right? They all have different levels of capacity. And the thing that I've always had in my heart, like this one desire, Holly's heard me say this before, you don't have to archive everything. Just pick one thing, and be great at that. There are communities within Black culture that are dying for a place, their materials to go to. You don't have to collect the whole civil rights movement. It's a wonderful subject. It is. Where are the Black chemists' papers going? Where are the Black engineers' papers going? Where are the Black beauticians and funeral homes and like these other stalwarts of the community? And you already have a built-in constituency that can actually advocate for you. So as an archivist, as a one-person shop, or oh Lord help us if it's two people, you got somebody on the outside putting pressure on the administration and saying, no, my stuff is there. I need y'all to go make sure my people are good and my stuff is good. So that's my soapbox speech.
No, but thank you both again. Some incredibly insightful answers talking about everything that we face from systemic structural racism and oppression to the lack of support. But again, you all both made excellent points about institutions where there wasn't an Ida Jones at Morgan or there wasn't a John Gartrell at Duke. So again, you all reading my mind, the segue into my last official question is how do we in this field as Black archivists and memory workers, how do we encourage and include more up and coming whether it's young people or people in the community, how we encourage more Black memory workers in the field and to do this work?
Well, I'll take this question, and I think it's fascinating because I came from a space that was about community. And so we actually are now the repository of the National Association of African American Human Resource Professionals. I didn't even know they had an organization. So their papers are here. So as well as the Prince Hall Masons of Greater Maryland as well. So reaching out and demystifying the space is very important. And there was one former employee who had an issue with this, saying, do you know what she's doing? She's letting people in there. Oh, God forbid, I'm letting people in the room. But at any rate, that was once again a dated way of thinking about things. But I think letting them see the space, touch the tools of the trade, ask the questions, learn how to write grants for themselves, create a 501c3 to your organization, add an archivist or historian position to your board of directors or your leadership cycle as a nonprofit. There are some fundamental things that you can do that will help empower that community group to do that for themselves. And I think one over here, the Morgan Park Civic Association, they have been over here a number of times, and they've done some oral histories, some other things like that. And they've got a number of historians in their community, so they understand the language, not the archival part, but they're learning that language. So we're really excited to kind of partner with them in community and have them ask questions, even if they want, I shouldn't say this, but get supplies and share some things till they get their own supplies. So all of this is essential in creating community. Then on the other part about succession planning, which I have sought to be intentional about, is to have it interdisciplinary. So one of my bestest persons who was here was an English major because she just loves stories. So she's reading all these letters and she's jazzing on the letters. My history major, of course, can't read cursive. I can't understand this. So, but at any rate, she decided to go into conservation. And so she never heard about conservation before. She thought she'd just be a history professor or a history techer. But when she came back from the HBCU Library Alliance up in was it Delaware, whether they had her, she's like, I want to be a conservator. I am so excited. So she got funding that we created a humidification chamber, and she was unscrolling photographs and encapsulating this and doing all the things. So she did all that. I think she went to Getty. I think she's now working at the Motion Picture Archives over there in California. But I had her give a tour to her classmates on the whole process. And I said, this is your show. I'm just the training wheels, and I will come off, and eventually you will wobble, but you're going to drive solo. So I think seeing her do that, and then she was always bringing other people by. You need to come over here and meet. You need to meet her. You need to meet her. She has money. She always has snacks. Well, evidently I like those things. And we take our shoes off, so it's a little bit kind of unconventional. But I said, don't tell everybody that. And another recent graduate of just last year, she's on her master's degree at Delaware, University of Delaware. And so she was taking the Spanish letters in one of our collections and translating and creating metadata behind that. So, and of course, she could read cursive. So it was very interesting to see how she was able to apply other skills to this. And so the intentions are to get a broad net, demystify the field and the process, and let them find, quote, the sex appeal in it where they are. My communication students love the digitization, the metadata, they love all that. So they're really jazzing on that. So I'm just really excited about how I see them coming alive and taking some ownership in this in terms of Morgan as his student, Morgan as a future alum, and then other fields in which they're going into. And so that's my kind of magic sauce. And then bring my alumni, and I have tons of alumni too. One lady, I said, I'm gonna dock your pay back here reading stuff. You're supposed to be going to the collections. She was in the stack. This is my yearbook picture. This is okay. Focus. We're supposed to be getting through the Scott collection. But at any rate, so I have both generations, and sometimes watching those two talk is also a spark, and so just making the opportunity available for conversation and demystifying has been very helpful.
I'm going to say this. Both of you are tremendous mentors, right? And Ida, you just spoke about your students and how, and I say that to say that I don't know that, it's almost like we're like a cult. Like if you show any interest in archives, hey man, we got something for you, right? So, and I think that some of it is, I think about my own experience. I didn't know what an archivist was when I was in college. Nobody ever presented to me as a possible career path or explained its importance, even though I was a history major and loved history, and that was my jam. But to Ida's point, like a lot of times it's presented in the context of, well, you will write or you will teach. Mm-hmm. And there's all these other tentacles and branches that you can go into if history, the past, creative arts, interdisciplinary studies is your jam too. And so I don't know that it's a problem amongst, I would say, us who are mid-career. I don't know what that means anymore. Like, when is mid-career over? When are you late career, right? But because I don't think any of us have a problem taking people under our wings and going, hey, here's all the things you can do. And when you get out in the world, put me down as a reference. And when you get out in the world at your first job and you got questions, call me and email me. If you've been doing it long enough, and in my own experience, what I found is that Black and BIPOC memory workers, archivists, museum curators, they just want to see the next generation win, right? Because we know that somebody mentored us. We're passing that tradition along. The problem, as I see it, is that we also need to be real about the amount of opportunities that actually exist. Because I've been in my position for 12 years. I don't really plan on going anywhere for a while. And Holly, I know you've been at Spelman for what, 10 years now? It's been yeah. Mm-hmm. And Ida, you've been at Morgan for 7, 8. And I'm not gonna put y'all on the spot and say that you're retiring tomorrow, but like if I wanted to be the Spelman College archivist, I can't do that because Holly Smith is there, right? And so
not yet.
Right, not yet. That's fine. That's fine. But if I just got my MLS, likelihood is your job isn't going to be available, right?
Meharry Medical is looking for somebody because there's a whole bunch of 70-year-olds trying to cycle out, and she's very intentional and wanting to replace herself. So there are some.
There are some. Atlanta, absolutely, absolutely. And so I think we mentor. I don't think mentorship is an issue. I'm just going to say that, like, all of the folks in our circle, we got people like, oh, they're really excited. As soon as you show any interest, hey, we got you. I got something for you. I got something for you to do. To me, it's about sort of the double side, the both ends of the what we call the pipeline, where you got to have something for people to feed into, and you got to have people that are going to go into those positions and give them the resources to be successful in it. And so I think as far as getting more Black professionals in the field, uh, for those of us who are at universities, there is a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to speaking to or having access to a kid in 8th grade to plant that seed right there and go like, 8th grade, hey, you like to read, you like books, here's what you can do in rare books and da-da-da. So there's not as natural of a path, but maybe there should be. And maybe that's a collaborative grant somewhere down the line. I don't know.
I think John just gave us some more work to do. No, but seriously, thank you both for, those incredible answers. And I think, as we all mentioned here, we're not only colleagues, but we're comrades, we're friends, we support each other, and we continue to mentor each other. So even if, and don't worry, I'm not planning on staying here infinitely. But as we prepare the next generations of Johns, of Hollies, of Ida, and I feel very blessed and grateful to be in community with so many brilliant students, brilliant. I know they're qualified, capable adults, but they feel like my babies in a lot of ways. And so my Spelman babies, and so many have expressed interest, some have gone on. So to see that and know they're getting incredible experience, so they'll be prepared to be in this role, which would be my dream to see one of the incredible Spelman uh, alumni and student that I've had the chance to mentor. And exactly as you both described, John, I'm blanking right now, but I remember meeting one of the students who you worked with at a conference and just glowed and was so appreciative of the way you poured into her. And Ida, exactly as you just described, pouring into. So I think that's a perfect way to open up, our conversation as we in this formal part of the conversation about how we remain inspired and encouraged by wanting to support the next generation, and also do want to take the opportunity to really give a shout out to our sister colleague Zakia Collier and the Black Memory Worker space that she created for all of us, just to be in community with each other, and also the We Hear community on social media as well is a space for BIPOC memory workers to come with resources. So please, look into those resources if you haven't. But just want to give tremendous thanks to two people I love and admire dearly for their wonderful insights, and just delighted to be in conversation. And we'll move to the Q&A. I see a couple of questions popping in now, and I want to give a huge thank you to Wesley and Madison for helping to facilitate that, because I joked and said I get excited, so I get distracted. So I see we have a couple questions, and so I will start with this first one. And I apologize in advance if I am mispronouncing your name, but Jolivet says, thank you for this panel discussion. Thank you for this panel discussion. I'm watching with my first year seminar students at St. Michael's College in Vermont. Come on, Northeast. And the class is titled Black Voices of Democracy. And Jolivet noticed they do have to log off soon. So I'm going to hop to this next question from the class. So one of the students asks, how would you approach a community that doesn't want their history archived, but should be for the benefit of others? And that student is Lila from St. Michael. So thank you for that insightful question, Lila.
Do you want to answer that, John, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Why don't you take a stab first?
Okay. Well, actually, I'm looking at the idea of Black silences. That's a term that I've come up with. Maybe it already existed, because I'm looking at my mother before she passed away. I found a cache of pictures. I'm like, Mom, who is this? She's dressed in a wedding gown. I'm like, this isn't Dad. Anyway, long story short, she was married before my father. And so there was something that I felt that I needed to know, but it was not my story. So at some point, even in regards to a community, be it a small community, be it a homogenous community, be it a family, some stories people don't want to record, and you have to respect that. If you are inquisitive enough and want to document the evidence of a community, then you would then put on your journalistic hat and start to do the kind of sniffing and digging around that periphery. But there is an intentionality to Black silences for whatever pain, trauma, or detriment, fear of this. I found it to be here at Morgan as well, in terms of some of their history, because having gone to Howard, Howard is all that matters as far as I'm concerned. But Morgan has a very deep footprint and a very expansive footprint that I never knew about. And I knew about the Methodist Church. I knew this, I knew that. But some of the things that I've been able to uncover are amazing. And I said, now I understand why, because the state is so racist and repressive that they had to keep certain movements underground because it would lead them to expose themselves to greater repression. So when you kind of step back and take a bigger look at the picture of the community, what would lead to this not wanting to be remembered or not wanting to be, quote, on someone's shelf? So that becomes very important, that you kind of step back a bit and look broader to understand some of the why, and then respect that if they choose not to. But for your personal research, maybe document some of that.
And I would just sort of add, all you can really do is ask. One of the things that when we talk about, especially Black communities, is that for so long it has been out of their hands whether or not their materials would be preserved or not, right? So in this moment, they have a decision to say, yes, I would like to have my art, my materials preserved, or no, I don't really care about it. That breaks my heart as an archivist and a historian. But to Ida's point, that silence exists for a reason, right? What you could do on the side, though, is do your own collecting around the community. And that is a way to at least get something that, whether it's ephemeral, whether it might be a program, it might be like you can create your own archive of that organization. And even if that's the only thing that remains once they are done or no longer extant, that we do have some record of them. But I think it's also important to recognize, though, that like archives weren't created to save everything. And so there will be instances, as heartbreaking as it might seem, that a story will not get captured. And in some way, shape, or form, you have to kind of let it go.
No, and thank you. And just to really shore up, you all have answered that beautifully in agreement, recognizing, as you all said, the people's humanity, and also a difference between, I'm forgetting, but one of our colleagues pointed this out, secrecy and privacy. So I think of secrecy, like the intentional misrepresentation or hiding or lack, mitigating access to records, but also recognizing individuals and people's right to privacy. And you both illuminated that. And what does that say? Even acknowledging the humanity that we've so often been denied as Black people, people of color occupying intersectional identities. So I thought that was a really beautiful and powerful way to think about being secretive versus being private and respecting someone else's right to privacy as part of dignity and humanity and respect. Absolutely. Thank you both so much. So going to our next question. I'm a Black woman and emerging archivist, graduated in May, but I am so hesitant to go into academic archives because of the systemic institutional issues, reparative work and bureaucracy, plus zero, not getting paid enough, 5 years professional experience and a master's degree as well. Can you speak more to preserving Black history as a consultant and other paid paths you've seen? That's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that.
I think it's important that you keep an entrepreneurial streak. Most of us will need multiple streams of income as this century moves on, and various things are not going to be as stable as they are. However, the novelty of having finished within less than a year, I don't know how credible it might be to certain communities to come in and offer services. I would think if you can create a 501c3 or get an LLC and kind of do some additional things to build your brand, that might be important. And also to cycle in or circle in on what you're trying to do. Are you talking analog materials, digital materials, photographs, documents, material culture? So once you create your brand and kind of know what your statement of work is for your business, that will then help you find your audience. Because at the end of the day, one of the classes we teach here at Morgan is how to write grants and write yourself into one. So whether it's a religious institution, a fraternal institution, a civic institution, who might have history, then they kind of could use you in the grant, or you could help them find a grant and write yourself in as well, so that there is money coming in and there's other things along those lines. So there are some safeguards, because offering consultation, I don't know, I'm just, you say you haven't graduated, you just graduated. That's a little bit new in the field. I wouldn't feel comfortable myself personally offering advice without having that tested and true. And so maybe aligning yourself with some additional teaching and certification and building your brand, getting the LLC and creating the business name and the model, and kind of honing your craft in terms of what you're trying to market, sell, or offer as a skill or as a service would be very helpful. And then, of course, to start off small, and then make sure that those small steps are solidly done well, because people can just use your skill set and abuse you and say she didn't do it right, they didn't do it right. So be very careful, because that good intentionality, working with our people in particular, can whiplash in a very bad way, because once they got what they needed, I don't need you anymore. And so be very careful of those kinds of, boomerangs.
I'll add just a couple of suggestions. If you're thinking about outside an institution, I would look into the book trade and booksellers and working with people at bookstores, book dealers. That is a facet of sort of traditional library institutional acquisition practice that is criminally underrepresented. And from there, I would build towards becoming an appraiser. Because when it comes to, appraising Black collections, there is a dearth of people of color that do that type of work. That industry is more white than Black library, than librarianship, period. Full stop. The second thing I'll say is that regardless of if you find yourself in an institution or out of an institution, I would say you cultivate community with like-minded professionals. And I'm gonna kick it to Holly for maybe some potential places and organizations where this wonderful student can show up, where they will be in community with people like us that's not just on the screen here.
Yeah, I would say, so shoring out what my two dear colleagues said, I would also recommend looking, this is still a virtual space, but joining the Black Memory Workers group, and you can do that from our sister colleagues' website, Zakia Collier. If you go, and Zakia, incidentally, I'm putting on blast, but has worked institutionally for a number of great institutions, such as the Schomburg also does consulting now. So to my colleague's point, maybe working in spaces. Thank you so much, John, for putting that link in the chat. So joining the virtual space of Black Memory Workers, and we meet once a month, and we're just in community each other, but to reach out as you feel comfortable wherever you are geographically, just to be in community with people to talk about these things. And it's been a really affirming space to talk about everything from, the anger that we feel, again, from everything from all the state sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies, to the pandemic, to just shooting the, having a good time and getting advice like that. So I would definitely recommend that. And then also, I think all of us having worked in academia, knowing those challenges, also thinking about maybe even looking at a community-based archive or another type of memory work institution that maybe is not based in academia as well, because those do exist. And I would also be happy to be in community with you. I am very easy to find, Holly Smith, on Spellman's website. But just again, want to emphasize that myself, John, and Ida, as we've talked about today, we really take that very seriously. So speaking for my colleagues, and I don't think they mind saying, please do feel free to be in community and reach out to us directly so that we can further support you in whatever ways that be helpful. But definitely, I would definitely recommend joining the We Hear community on Facebook and Instagram. If you use social media, there's also an excellent website, and the Black Memory Workers Group, just to start to be able to find in-person community as well as virtual.
All right, so I'm going to hop in to ask the next questions to the panelists. We have a question from Brady Lasher, who says, what can we do as white allies to help archivists? How do we uplift or encourage in the aspect of archiving?
Well, to answer that question, being here is one thing. I don't know in terms of encouragement, is it a person or an institution? We had just recently had Dana Chandler, who was a white man at Tuskegee University, who didn't even come out of an archival background, but he brought the technology piece. And he was very clear that he wasn't going to try to come in any kind of paternalistic way. He knew what he looked like. He knew his origin story. And he took the job because it was close to home, so he could be next to his family. So he was very clear on his intentionalities and never sought to be fawning. So I think being your authentic self in that space, whatever that means to you, and just simply either trying to learn or trying to offer, if you have, of course, we're talking about grant writing skill sets, and then mentoring. There's all kinds of persons who are of mixed race ancestry. Everyone's not either Black or white. There's a whole bunch of Asian, Latino, and other mixed race persons on the planet. So I think it's a human issue. When you see the humanity in somebody else who loves the field or loves history or the technology and likes to share, then you can connect on that frequency. And I think on the frequency, when you connect with colleagues, then you actually become the resource instead of having to think about it. So I think connecting on some of the emotional levels or frequencies would be of greater help that would then drive you to the community that you can be of service to.
I'll let you go first, Holly.
I was going to jump in, echoing amen the corner. I would say one word that I really like, rather honestly than ally, is accomplice, because I feel like it's stronger. And ally can allow, a soft kind of detached, like, I'm supporting you space. But I would encourage you, as an accomplice, exactly like Ida and John said, accepting, the transparency of privilege that race, certain gender identities, class, all the things that can bring in. And thankfully, as Ida and John mentioned, I just want to give a special shout out to one particular colleague, Biff Hollingsworth, who I used to work at UNC Chapel Hill. And if you know Biff, Biff is a white man from Georgia, but just always had a transparency. Particularly, we were doing a lot of work working in Black communities, and just Biff has always been able to really build those great relationships, because he knows how he shows up, as Ida just mentioned, but also does not privilege his voice in those spaces. Understands again that being a guest in someone's house, and myself as a Black cis hetero woman who's fortunate to do a lot of work, particularly with our queer students, realizing how I show up in my identity, seating my voice does not need to be the loudest. So I think, ask those who, white colleagues who want to be accomplices, and anybody who you're working in communities where that might not be your identity, just being quiet, seating the space, but willingness to use your privilege in any space that you have to speak up against injustices. When you see a student or a Black coworker being mistreated, marginalized, tokenized, actually saying something to administration or doing the meaningful work that way, and being able to advocate for the work, I think, without centering yourself, or I'm again including thus centering ourselves in this work and collectivity. So I strongly encourage that transparency, being able to advocate for colleagues, not in a patriarchal, paternalistic way, but with respect. And again, just listening, silence sometimes, allowing other people to speak about their experiences and not always including your thought or perspective, because that's not their focus.
I agree with everything that's already been said. And if I could add a couple more layers to it, I would also say that sometimes as a non-BIPOC or a white individual, you might find yourself in a room, a space, a meeting, a conversation where you have an opportunity to speak up on behalf of a Black or BIPOC colleague, but circle back to confirm that the message that you are delivering actually reflects what their wishes might be, or stop the meeting and come get one of us and say, no, we're not moving forward until this person is at the table because this is really impacting them. And the second thing that I would say is that, especially in predominantly white settings, there is a level of capacity that many Black librarians, archivists are given because of who they are. So if there is a diversity committee, if there is a inclusion committee, if there is, hey man, I don't need to be in all those places. I don't. Show up in those places, right? So what I'm saying is take some stuff off of their plates. That's another way to be an accomplice, as Holly so eloquently put, is that recognize the load that your colleague may be carrying and say, you know what, I can take some of that stuff, but you don't need to work with this class. You already working with 4 classes this week. Um, and and actually do that kind of thing to show the humanity and the empathy. Um, and I would just generally say education, educate yourself. And know that many of and I don't have to tell, I didn't preach this sermon, but I'll preach it. Know that many of the practices that we do in our industry, in our field, were generated by Black librarians. And so educate yourself about that facet of the work too.
All right, we have 2 more questions. We'll see if we can get both of them, but both of them are from Sydney Martin, and she says, hello. I'm curious if you have any advice for incoming library professionals and archivists at PWIs who want to begin to create connections within the Black community or communities around the university to archive their history, especially when starting from scratch or when there's very little work that has been done before. And she's a first-year library student.
Oh boy.
I don't mind starting. I'm sorry, John.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Holly. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I want to echo what I was going to say. I want to echo what John and Ida, said before, and thank you for your questions. And I think the most important thing would be to understand what has been done before, because just because it might not be at a particular entity or institution doesn't mean that communities haven't been documenting their, through churches or through community organizations. So if you have any community connections or individuals that just can connect you, but I think, as John said, showing up and being also transparent but intentional about building relationships. I think, having worked at a PWI and had varying experiences, I think there's this expectation again that and I myself, as a Black woman working in Black communities, like I was going to be the token, the fixer. I'm going to go into the Black community, right, and do that work. And I didn't want to be utilized that way. But the most important thing to me was about building relationships. I was in North Carolina in that area at the time, to build collaborative relationships. So I think even just kind of reframing that idea about how communities are archiving their history, as again, as Ida and John eloquently said, the most important thing is about building collaborative relationships. So whether archival materials come through the door, they don't need to come through the doors of a PWI. They don't need to come through the doors of an HBCU, but most importantly, how might we be able to work collaboratively and not co-optively to document community history? So I think first starting there about building collaborative relationships, doing a lot of, seeing who your connections are, doing a lot of listening and being intentional about building the relationship. This isn't something that's going to take weeks or months. It might take years really to build up a lot of trust. But I think, again, when the motivation overall, again, as my colleague said, is the important thing. How can we collectively preserve things together rather than extract or just feel like we have to do this work because we're at these institutions? I think building collaborative relationships are more equitable justice and better for our collective history in the long run.
I'll just build on that. And the thing that I would emphasize is because you're starting from scratch, you actually have an opportunity to do some real self-assessment about what your capacity is. Many of us sometimes inherit communities that are coming from us from so many different angles that we're like, whoa, I didn't know it was going to be all of this, right? And to sort of build on what Holly mentioned, sometimes you're hired in these spaces to work with all the people. And it's like, no, no, you can't do that, because if you do, you'll burn yourself out. And when you get burnt out after building a constituency, then they start to look at the institution, and that trust is broken again, right? What we want is an actual fruitful, long-standing relationship that is equitable and allows each party to have skin in the game. Um, because what you might be bringing is resources, and what they're bringing is the stuff. I'm just that's the most basic through line of this. Um, but before you even get started, be clear about what your capacity is and the reasons why working with this community are important. Because as Holly said, you may be talking about years long building of relationships, and you can't sprint a marathon, right? So in order to run a marathon, you got to pace yourself. And that's what starting from scratch sort of looks like, is setting a pace that, and sometimes you don't know it until you start doing it. I mean, that's the truth. Um, but the other thing is to say to whoever it is you report to, is that some of this work needs to happen without me being behind this desk. And they need to be okay with that. And if they're not okay with that, then I would hard stop. Or then we can't do it. We can't, because it's not going to be fruitful. Um, and so there's some negotiation that oftentimes takes place between your report and you as a staff member, and you're being thrust into this position. Um, and unfortunately, that advocacy part sometimes just falls on you. Um, so I know that feels really daunting. I don't want this to sound like but I mean, I'm trying to be real. Like, y'all know me. I don't try to mince words. So
Did you want to answer the question? No. Okay. And so we do have another question, and it's, how can you set up collections or connections within these communities in a way that they won't be misused or forgotten once you leave the institution? And is that even possible?
I'll take a piece of that. You cannot control who your successor will be and their intentions or what the institution wants them to do. Ideally, all the collections should be equally weighted as they are equally valued by the institution, one would think. But researcher trends, funding, and other things drive what becomes attractive or important to whoever's sitting in those spaces at that time. So the best you can do is just be your own kind of town crier about what other institutions have. As you heard, my colleagues have been at multiple places and they've worked at a variety of places. And I'm sure some of the collections of earlier institutions might be relevant in the current institution. Well, I'm looking for such and such or so. Oh, I know they have a collection of that at so and so, and I know so and so had that. So you're always in the reference space in terms of allowing your previous work or volunteering or internships build your own kind of reference in your own mind, or your ready reference file in your own head. So that's very important. Ideally, if the collection is static, meaning that there's no living members of that community or family or organization, then it will just rise and fall on the merits of its relevance to the research trends. But if there is a family involved and there are still descendants that are willing to be involved, then I would just kind of tap them to kind of take that lead to be able to let people know what their family has donated, where it is in the condition that it's in. So they can actually be agents of their own narrative in some regard.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll agree with Ida and just say the same thing, that you really can't control what happens when you leave. I remember when I moved from the Afro to Duke, you know, I like to think that they were really happy with the work that I did. But I told them, I said, listen, if y'all can't keep using this, then I failed, right? It shouldn't all be on me. Like, we should have set up something that is able to be sustained beyond my presence as in charge of this, being in charge of this collection. And so hopefully doing good work will plant that seed and allow that plant to grow. Um, you can always circle back and check in, and just sort of keep an eye, because now you might be shifting into an advocacy role for that collection, versus being a caretaker. And there's a little bit more power in being an outside agitator than it is being an inside agitator. So if you really have that care for it, um, and you have the capacity for it, then that might be an opportunity for you to ensure that the collection and the materials are at least in similar condition to when you left.
I'm just going to add an amen and ashe to the words that already been said.
Okay. And so we don't have any more questions from those who are watching. And so I'll just end it with a comment that we have from Beth Castle, who thanks the panelists and says, "I'm so grateful for your wisdom and experience. It was fundamentally healing and generative to listen to you today. I've been trying to sprint a marathon from the start, and I know you all work so hard and mentor so many. Just wanting to offer that heartfelt thanks for your efforts, knowing you make a difference." And we want to say thank you to our panelists today, and thank you so much for watching. It's 4:56. We're 4 minutes early from ending. So thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you all so much. And it was just an honor and delight always to be in community with my
Appreciate
fam.
appreciate y'all. Appreciate y'all. Hopefully we'll get to see each other in person soon. God knows where that will be, but
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thank